Om. Om. Oh, hey, welcome back to part two of our Red Scare lecture. And I want to talk to you about the realities and limits of Cold War civil rights. For those African Americans who chose to run afoul of the Red Scare, chose to reject America's containment culture, chose to reject the Cold War politics of the Truman and Eisenhower administrations. I mean people like Paul Robeson, we saw their lives destroyed. What about those who chose to continue the double V, to continue to stress the Americanness of African Americanness, and to use that as leverage for advancing civil rights for African Americans? Well, they actually saw some significant progress. This brings us to Walter White, who is head of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP was one of the premier double V organizations of World War II. And it saw its membership jump from 50,000 to 450,000 by war's end. It had it too had made the shift away from trying to make separate but equal work and move it towards ending Jim Crow outright. And so the NAACP is going to look to take on, particularly through the legal system, through court cases, is going to look to take on Jim Crow segregation. Now, where does the NAACP and its head, Walter White, pictured in the center there, where do they come down on kind of the civil rights? Well, Walter White was actually good friends with Paul Robeson, W.B. Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois, after all, was one of the founders of the NAACP. Walter White believed in this connection between ending colonialism in Africa and advancing civil rights within the United States. They all were committed to the double V, fighting fascism abroad and ending fascism at home in terms of Jim Crow segregation. And then along comes the Cold War, and as we've seen, the Cold War forced African Americans to make some decisions. Were they going to continue the double V of stressing African Americans' Americanness in order to win advances in civil rights? Understand that where America's kind of international reputation comes into all this. With FDR, the United States was presenting itself as the arsenal of democracy, the world's leading democracy. With the Truman Doctrine speech, America is the leader of the free world. Throughout these years, the double V years, African Americans have said, how can you say you're the world's leading democracy? How can you talk about leading the free world when you continue to deny basic civil rights to African Americans? And so African Americans very deftly through the 1940s played upon America's international reputation to highlight, here you present yourself as the world's leading democracy. You continue to discriminate against African Americans. Understand that the Soviets and other rivals of the United States, they very much used racial discrimination within the United States. They loved stories of African Americans being discriminated against, and they used those to highlight the contradictions of the United States. You know, the United States pretends it's a democracy, but look at how it treats its population. And so a concern for America's international reputation was something that particularly concerned presidents, from FDR all the way down to Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. This is where kind of the international civil rights plays in here as well too. How we need to understand that civil rights advances within the United States occurred in an international context of fighting for democracy, trying to lead the free world. And African Americans, from Robeson to Walter White through World War II, had fought this double V campaign. Will they continue to do it now as the enemy shifts from the Nazis to the commies? And we saw with Paul Robeson, the answer was a kind of no. What will Walter White and the NAACP They will ultimately choose to continue the double V, to continue, they will choose to toe the anti-communist line of these years. They will choose to accept the Red Scare as they see it to advance civil rights. This is what Walter White would say about African Americans. He says, Negroes are American. In the event of any conflict that our nation has with any other nation, we will regard ourselves as Americans and meet the responsibilities as Americans. Very clearly distinguishing himself and the NAACP from people like Paul Robeson and W.B. Du Bois. In fact, Walter White and the NAACP would kick W.B. Du Bois out of the very organization he had founded in 1948 over Du Bois's supposed communist ties. Walter White would go on to write one of those negative articles bashing Paul Robeson, leading some historians to say Walter White was a sellout. Well, he certainly did sell out this international dimension of civil rights that people like Robeson and Du Bois had been fighting for. You know, Walter White, like many African Americans, just gave up challenging Truman and Eisenhower administrations and their policies regarding Africa. They gave up on the idea of ending African American colonialism, but they did so for the very strategic reason of trying to use America's Cold War leadership to advance civil rights causes. After Truman gave his speech, Walter White would go to Harry Truman and kind of point this out to him. These are Walter White's words. Acts of discrimination against minorities abroad are being used to discredit the United States and convince the people of the world that Americans are incurably addicted to bigotry. You know, White saying to Truman, look, you're very concerned about America leading the free world. Understand that what's happening with African Americans in the United States, treatment of returning war veterans, for instance, that so troubled Paul Robeson. White's saying, look, this is a problem. These stories are getting picked up by the international press. They're being used by regimes like the Soviets to suggest that Americans are, in White's words, incurably addicted to bigotry. So White challenges Truman to, quote, let the people of the world know that while Americans frequently fail to live up to their declarations of democracy, we are constantly at work to narrow the margin between our protestations of freedom and our practice of them. In other words, what White is doing is using America's free world leadership to point out this hypocrisy of American democracy and American apartheid, or democratic rights for some, based primarily on being white. And Walter White is challenging the Truman administration to, if you want to effectively conduct the Cold War, if you want to effectively unite Americans around a Cold War consensus in fighting the Soviets abroad and communists at home, fighting on American activities at home, then you have to advance civil rights for African Americans. You have to get over this hypocrisy of protesting freedom, yet practicing discrimination, racial oppression, and apartheid. And Truman understood that. 1948, the same year the Marshall Plan is introduced, Truman introduced a robust civil rights package. He wanted to make, for instance, the Fair Employment Practices Commission of World War II, he wanted to make that permanent, a way to police discrimination in American businesses, police racial discrimination in American businesses. Truman wanted to advance all these things. Ultimately, Truman's civil rights package does not happen, and it has everything to do with the fact that the Democratic Party base is still in the South, which was primarily remained heavily segregationist during these years. And so nothing really happened with Truman's civil rights package. However, on the basis of the Cold War context and the way that African Americans are using the Cold War context to advance their cause, African Americans like Walter White and the NAACP would see some significant legislative victories. One I'll talk about in the future lecture, and the Supreme Court in 1948 struck down racially restrictive covenants. At that time in 1948, it was possible for neighborhoods to get together to pass a covenant that said, among other things, no blacks allowed. This is a white-only neighborhood. The Supreme Court in 1948 struck that down as unconstitutional. in part because of the Cold War context. One thing that Truman will be able to get passed in 1948 is the armed forces in 1948 are desegregated. We had fought World War II with a segregated military. In 1948, because of the protests of African Americans in the Truman administration, he will desegregate the military in 1948. A lot of people, at the time said, "Oh, it's going to hurt morale. We're not ready for it." It ended up working out pretty well. It was one of the first places and most robust places where you saw American society actually racially integrated was in the U.S. military. Had everything to do with America's Cold War image and the feeling of the Truman administration that they needed to get right on the question of civil rights if they were going to effectively conduct a war, a Cold War, a propaganda war against the Soviet Union. One of the most significant of the Cold War decisions, the NAACP would be pushing for school integration in the years after 1948, and that would come about when the Supreme Court in the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 ultimately decided that school segregation was bad and that America needed to move towards integrating its public school system. Now, part of the reason the Supreme Court makes this decision is a psychological one. The court had psychologists come and conduct experiments with children that kind of proved that segregation was not separate but equal, but segregation did leave African American children with a sense of inferiority to white young people. So that was part of the reasoning behind starting to end segregation. But when you read the Brown decision itself, what they stress in there is the need for, it's interesting. They don't mention the Cold War at all. Nevertheless, they stress the need for a common public school system, a robust public school system. And so while the Cold War is not explicitly mentioned in it, it's written all over that document. When you understand that this is the time in which Americans are trying to unite across all the lines that divide them, including racial lines, and are trying to use the institutions of American society to foster a strong consensus against un-American activities, against communist activities, for fighting the Cold War. Here the Supreme Court is saying we need a robust public school system, and that means having to end this idea of of separate schools, particularly underfunded schools for African Americans. So the Brown decision is a significant reversal. If in some ways the court had rationalized Jim Crow segregation back in the Plessy decision in 1896, the Brown decision in 1954 in many ways undercuts the separate but equal, legally undercuts the separate but equal doctrine. We could say in some ways the Brown decision begins the second Reconstruction, where in in the years after the Civil War, legally segregation had ended. Legally segregation was outlawed within the United States, but practice and with Supreme Court blessing allowed it to continue. And in the second Reconstruction, we would see that the courts, America's legal system, would begin to move on really kind of fulfilling the promises of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments from 100 years before. And so all's good, right? The Brown decision is handed down, and American public schools become integrated almost overnight. And American society becomes integrated, and we have significant racial harmony and significant racial integration within the United States today. Right? That's what happens, right? I imagine a number of you are smiling right now. You should be smiling right now because you know that isn't what happened, or that's not a good description of our present. We still have significant segregation, residential, school, church, entertainment, access to jobs, healthcare, what have you. You know, race continues to matter profoundly within the United States. But even at the time, schools were not integrated. Really, you don't get significant school integration until the 1970s. And so it kind of leaves us with the question, if we highlight Brown so much in our kind of telling of American history as a time in which Americans finally started getting right on the civil rights question, and that didn't in fact happen, or it didn't happen till later, did Brown have any immediate effect on the United States? And the answer is yes, it did. He got Southerners very, very angry. To them, the Brown decision was the Civil War all over again. It was those, in the Civil War, it was those damn Yankees. Now it's the Supreme Court. Now it's the federal government telling us how to run our own societies, how to manage our own people. And Southerners weren't having it. And so the immediate effect of Brown was not the integration of public schools in American society. In fact, the opposite occurred because of Brown. What we see, the immediate effect of Brown was the rise of a movement throughout the United States, but really centered in the South. It was where most visible in the South. A movement known as massive resistance. Let me just step back for a second there and highlight. You do have some school integration during, of course, the Central High, Little Rock in 1957. I just want to highlight quickly how this was factored into a Cold War context. This is Eisenhower speaking about why he decided ultimately to send federal troops in to integrate Little Rock Central High. Eisenhower writes, "In the South, as elsewhere, citizens are keenly aware of the tremendous disservice that has been done to the people of Arkansas in the eyes of the nation, and that has been done to the nation in the eyes of the world. At a time in which we face grave situations abroad because of the hatred that communism bears toward a system of government based on human rights, it would be difficult to exaggerate the harm that is being done to the prestige and the influence and indeed to the safety of our nation in the world. Our enemies are gloating over this incident and using it everywhere to misrepresent our nation. We are portrayed as a violator of those standards of conduct which the people of the world united to proclaim in the Charter of the United Nations. There, they affirmed faith in fundamental human rights and in the dignity and worth of the human person, and they did so without distinction as to race." So, again, just to highlight, whereas Brown did not necessarily talk about the Cold War, the decision to integrate public schools, particularly the Little Rock Central High decision, very much was informed by a Cold War context and Eisenhower's feeling that if America did not move on integrating public spaces, the Soviets were going to keep using this to build support for their leadership of the world, and it would undermine American free world leadership. Now, to get back to the story I had been telling, this massive resistance to the Brown decision. In many ways, Little Rock Central High was a consequence of massive resistance of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people who did not want to see American society, but particularly American schools, integrated during these years. And so the massive resistance campaign worked at many different levels. In many ways, the leaders of massive resistance in the South were Southern governors, including the Arkansas governor, who had resisted the integration of Little Rock Central High, Virginia's governor, which went so far as to, and many southern states did this, they actually closed their public schools. They actually closed their public schools. Rather than integrate those schools, they actually closed them, some for up to a year. And parents who had never homeschooled before suddenly found themselves trying to work with other parents to figure out how to provide an education for their kids while the public school system was shut down. If you can imagine, something like that ever happening in the past, certainly that would never happen in our own time, right? Massive homeschooling of youngsters. And so governors led this effort They pushed legislatures to pass new laws. Interestingly, African American there were African American school teachers in public schools before the Brown decision. After the Brown decision, most of those school teachers were fired. Interestingly, the Brown decision didn't integrate public schools and in some ways made them more, at least for the short run, made them more segregated as African American teachers found themselves fired from public schools. And spaces too. For instance, in Louisiana, the state legislature there in 1956 passed and here's a list of what they went after: an act to prohibit all interracial dancing, social functions, entertainment, athletic training, games, sports or contests, or other such activities, to provide for separate seating and other facilities for white and Negro, that all persons, firms, and corporations are prohibited from sponsoring, arranging, participating in, or permitting on premises under their control such activities involving personal and social contact in which the participants are members of the white and Negro races, that white persons are prohibited from sitting in or using any part of seating arrangements or sanitary or other facilities set apart for members of the Negro race, that Negro persons are prohibited from sitting in or using any part of seating arrangements and sanitary or other facilities set apart for white persons. Social distancing, if you will, to stop what many Southern leaders saw as the contagion of integration, contagion of racial equality. During these years, Southern society did not become more integrated after 1954. It became more segregated in many ways. I mean, there were all kinds of integrated activities throughout America and throughout the South during these years. NASCAR, for instance, was a place that many young white and African American individuals participated in NASCAR together. Rock and roll were integrated form of entertainment. Massive resistance tried to end all that. All that kind of informal integration through entertainment and common interests, for at least for a time being, was shut down through this kind of top-down massive resistance effort, including passing legislation forbidding African Americans to mix and certainly even to marry. But it wasn't just top-down; it was bottom-up too. You had the rise of citizens' councils during these years, particularly in several southern states. I think, let me check my notes here. Yeah, Mississippi, for instance, started in 1954. Mississippi's Citizens Council would eventually rise to have over 60,000 members. These citizens' councils were kind of like the Klan in broad daylight. Yes, the Klan remained active, even rejuvenated during these years in several southern states. The citizens' councils acted as the Klan during the day. They supervised, made sure that interracial activity, in a lot of cases, it was middle class members who made up these citizens' councils, trying to police poor white Southerners and African Americans who integrated in places like rock and roll and NASCAR. These citizens' councils tried to police these activities. A lot of the activity of the citizens' councils was nonviolent. If they found out there was some kind of integration or support for integration, they would try to get those people fired or unemployed in some kind of way. They harassed in peaceful kinds of ways. But again, just trying to highlight here this idea we have, the Brown decision represented a turning point in American society where America began integrating during these years. It's pretty misleading. The immediate effect of the Brown decision is that Americans, particularly Southern Americans, doubled down on racial segregation and on white superiority during these years. The citizens' councils, as I said, were nonviolent. A lot of massive resistance was nonviolent, but in some cases it did turn violent, and that brings us to our final story, the story of Emmett Till. Till was a young boy, about 14, I believe, from Chicago. He went down to Mississippi to visit his cousin for the summer. And on one particular day, Emmett and his cousin went to a nearby convenience store, for lack of a better term, and we don't know what happened. As best as we can tell, Emmett Till, when he was leaving the store, he whistled at the store owner's wife. At least that's what his cousin would say he did. We don't exactly know what happened. We know what his wife said. Her husband had been away on a trip with a couple guys. When he came back, this store owner's wife said, "Hey, Emmett Till grabbed me and fondled me." What are the chances that a 14-year-old boy would have grabbed an adult white woman and begin caressing her? Probably not very good. But her story does feed into this idea of Southern men having to protect white femininity, fragile white femininity from the dangerous, aggressive black male. This mythos had been there for a long time. It had been used to justify thousands of lynching of African Americans. And in this particular case, it's being used by this woman to justify some kind of action taken against Emmett Till. So it is at a few days after this incident that the store owner's husband, his brother, go to where Emmett Till was staying. Around midnight, they take Emmett Till and kidnap him. They take him down to a river. They beat him up, and they ultimately kill him and throw him in a river. Everybody knew who did this. Nevertheless, when these guys were put on trial, they ultimately were acquitted. A magazine came to them, came to these guys a few weeks after, and said, "Hey, would you tell us, what really happened?" And they're like, "Yeah, sure. We killed him." They could tell them because they already been tried and acquitted for this, so they were free to tell their story. And I said, "Yeah, we killed Emmett Till. We didn't mean to. Right? We just wanted to." We just wanted to kind of put him in his place. We wanted to send a message, that he needed to check himself. But he just kept staring at it. He kept looking at us in defiance, and so we had to kill him. Was their conclusion. They were left with no choice but to kill this 14-year-old boy. And so this is the effect of the Brown versus Board of Education. It's not integration. It's creating social conditions in which a 14-year-old boy could be tortured and murdered just for whistling at a woman. But the story of Emmett Till doesn't end there. The story is also suggestive of how the civil rights movement in the Cold War era is going to advance. And it's going to advance by exposing white violence. Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi. The state of Mississippi wanted to get him in the ground as quickly as they possibly can. They didn't want anyone to see what Emmett Till looked like when he was brought up out of the river. But he's not from Mississippi, he's from Chicago. So Emmett Till's mother sues the state of Mississippi to get her son returned to Chicago. Ultimately, Mississippi's, they have to. They relent and say, all right, we'll turn Emmett Till, but it's got to be a closed casket funeral. We're sealing this thing up. You can't reopen it. Emmett Till's mother fights for an open casket funeral. She said, in her words, "I want the world to see what they did to my boy." And she wins the right to have an open casket funeral. And so, in 1955, there's Emmett Till. In 1955, 50,000 people will go to Emmett Till's funeral and ultimately see what happened to this young man as a result of the massive resistance to the Brown versus Board of Education decision. But in an era of mass media and mass news, Emmett Till did not remain in that in that space. As Paul Robeson would say in 1956, you can keep me from traveling abroad, you can't keep Emmett Till from traveling abroad. And these images traveled throughout the world, exactly the kind of thing that the Eisenhower administration had been trying to avoid. These images traveled around the United States, galvanizing the civil rights movement. Right? It's not an accident that Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. emerge in the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycotts in 1955, the same year in which Emmett Till is murdered, but ultimately Emmett Till's murder is exposed before a watching world. These things are all connected. Emmett Till's murder, highlighted in this particular kind of way, will galvanize support in the United States for progressing the civil rights movement. I wouldn't say there's a direct connection between Till's death and the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first Civil Rights Act passed in the United States for a very long time. But certainly Till's murder and the exposure of that murder in a Cold War context created conditions for the advance of civil rights. And ultimately, as I'll talk about in future lecture, people like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, other civil rights leaders will, I mean, we talk about them as nonviolent, but ultimately these were individuals who were courting violence. They wanted massive resistors to act violently, and they wanted to capture that on film because they realized, and they learned this through Emmett Till, they realized when they captured massive resistance violence on film, the federal government was forced to act because the federal government was in charge of America's reputation as the world's leading democracy. How can the United States present itself as a democracy when they allow 14-year-old boys to be murdered just for whistling? And so understand the connection between America's advances in civil rights and the Cold War context. Right? Civil rights advances in the 1950s and 1960s occurred in a Cold War context, and especially occurred as African Americans, like from Walter White to Rosa Parks to Martin Luther King Jr. to other activists, successfully used America's reputation as an international, the world's leading democracy, used America's reputation to advance civil rights at home. Eventually, something of Robeson's international civil rights, connecting the struggle for civil rights in the United States to the struggle to end colonialism in Africa. Eventually, African Americans would rediscover that in the 1960s, but before then, it's really this continuation of the double V from the World War II years that is really the most significant story advancing civil rights in the United States. So, what was the Cold War effect on the African American population in the United States? I conclude it was a pretty mixed bag. For some African Americans, like Paul Robeson, they saw their lives destroyed and their politics ruined through their refusal to toe the anti-communist line. However, for other African Americans, they saw significant legislative, significant legal victories, precisely because of the way that they managed the Cold War. We will talk more about this in future lectures on the civil rights. Thanks for hanging along, and we are done with our first full-length audio lecture. Again, this material from Lecture 8, I apologize, it's called Lecture 9. It is Lecture 8 as according to the syllabus. This is material for your midterm number 2. See y'all later.